read from this one. Recording in progress. Ding.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Charlotte and the remote body and to Resting Up. And, you know, it's so amazing that we can all kind of collaborate and come together and create space for events like this. And I feel very grateful. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. And yeah, it's really nice to be here, and I feel very lucky to be able to talk to you about this book. I'm just going to open it up. I was saying to Jen before, I left my copy of My Body Keeps Your Secrets in London because I am very disorganized. So I'll be reading from my screen. So if the light changes, that's why. So I'm just going to read a section from the first chapter of this book. This book kind of goes through and tells different stories of different people that I interviewed about their relationship with their bodies and about trauma and shame. So this first chapter kind of sets that up. So I'm just going to read from a bit from there. Since I read Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, I have spent 2 years trying to help my body recover from my sexual assault. But in that time, I have received hundreds of emails and notes from women, trans and non-binary people around the world who are trying to reclaim their bodies too. This has made me want to test my theory that all the things we hold in our body, all the secrets we keep for other people, have a cumulative effect, that the body is a canvas, that everything shows up there eventually, that oppression has a physical dimension, that structural barriers take the body as their primary battleground. The body tells the secrets we try to keep, the ones we keep from ourselves, the ones we keep on behalf of the people who have wronged us. So to test my theory, I started interviewing women, trans and non-binary people about how they feel about their bodies to see if any versions of my own story came up in my reporting. I put a few call outs on Twitter and Instagram for interview subjects. All I said was that I wanted to speak to people about their relationships with their bodies. I didn't go into anything more specific than that. The stories rolled in. In total, I spoke to more than 100 people for this book. I collected hundreds of stories about each person's life inside one body. I spoke to people between the ages of 13 and 37. I spoke to them for hours and days and weeks and months. The stories they wanted to tell me were about their bodies, but they were also about all the things we have to use our oppressed bodies to navigate: love and intimacy, motherhood or its absence, childhood, friendship, illness, pain. The story of the body is the story of everything. And for so many of us, the story of everything is the story of shame. Each of these stories is true in its entirety and in its detail. I have not shielded you from the worst parts, although at points you may wish I had. I've done that for a few reasons. The first is that these interview subjects have trusted me deeply and wholeheartedly with their testimonies, and I believe it would be disrespectful to water them down. The second is that just as they trusted me, their audience, I in turn trust you to hold these stories no matter how messy or uncomfortable they become. The third is that this project, to me at least, is meaningless if it does not actually represent the truth of what I was told. The final reason is that shying away from things we are afraid of is what caused the suffering depicted in this book in the first place. My interview subjects told me details about their childhoods, their teenage years, their childbearing or otherwise years and beyond. I have attempted in this book to reconstruct their stories into a chronological narrative that takes you on a journey through one life made up of a constellation of different stories and experiences, to show you the many ways that shame can invade our lives and at how many different junctures it can appear. Imagine what we could do with our time and energy if we decided to tell the truth about our bodies, if we were to reject the idea that a body is designed as a canvas to construct an alternate truth and embrace the idea that it is designed to be a truth in itself. In her book, Constellations, the writer Sinead Gleason says, "I am an accumulation of all those sleepless nights and hospital days, of waiting for appointments and wishing I didn't have to keep them, of the raw keel of boredom and self-consciousness illness is. Without those experiences, I would not be a person who picks up those shards and attempts to reshape them on the page. If I had been spared the complicated bones, I would be somebody else entirely, another self, a different map. Every woman, trans and non-binary person carries complicated bones that they have been taught to believe are shameful, but they are not. The acts that make up these complicated bones, neglect, abuse, misogyny, objectification, are not these people's shame to carry. They are the beliefs and behavior of shameless people who refuse to carry it themselves. So over centuries, things have become very confused. It is not us who should be ashamed. It is those who refuse to carry the shame. Our bones are not wretched in their complexity, but beautiful. They are testaments not to the worst things that have been done to us, but to how we survived them. This book is a testament to those complicated bones. I am glad I am not a different map."
Thank you so much, Lucia. Every time I read your book again, something different sticks with me, and I'll just be thinking days about maps or shards or all of the different spaces that we make up of narrative. And I think I'd like to open with talking to you about the process of writing this book. And one of the things that I think you construct really well from your interviewees and what you highlight well in this book is the dialectical thinking of, you know, being in a liminal space in a shameful body or an ill body or a body with trauma. And so I'm lifting the term dialectical thinking from dialectical behavioral therapy, which encourages seeing situations from multiple perspectives, at times reconciling contradictory perspectives or trying to improve mental health. So in short, the way I see it is that many things can be true at once. And the way I see your book as dialectical is the way in which many of your participants can both consistently and concisely articulate trauma in a way that's very much mature beyond their years, but are still living with the aftermath and through periods of illness, a category that you yourself occupy as a chronically ill person living with PTSD. And on page 41, you recount a conversation with your therapist in Sydney about your first book, I Choose Elena. And you say in a conversation, which I'm sure many people have had before, I should be better now, I tell him. What do you mean? Why am I still doing this? You then give him a copy of your book and he says, there is so much more than what is in these very boundaried pages. There is all the nuance, he says, the stuff you don't understand. That's what you need to try and tackle in your next book. And while dealing with trauma is a lifelong work, I wonder how the scope and process of writing this book felt compared with I Choose Elena, and whether it did, as your therapist suggested, lead you to more nuances in your own healing and understanding and growth.
Yes, well, thank you for that beautifully articulated question. And you've just given, I'm going to come away thinking about so many of the phrases you just said, because do you know, I really feel like the last 3 years of thinking so much about trauma and about illness and about the connection between all of these things, one of the things that underscores all of that the most, I think, is learning that 2 things can be true at the same time. And in fact, 5 things can be true at the same time. 5 things that might feel contradictory can all exist in one body. And that's not something I grew up believing. That's not something there was any space for in my head. And, I really do feel like that idea of nuance and allowing things to exist as they truly are, rather than as a simplified version of themselves, is a big part of my healing, really, and of being able to cope with both trauma and illness. And I'm so glad that you picked up on that section of the book, because I I struggled so much to write this book. And I think the reason was exactly because I set out to try and make it really truthful in its ability to acknowledge contradictions and to acknowledge the things that we're confused about, right? But I'm not very good at doing that. And so it just made me feel like I wasn't writing a very good book, because, you know, it made me feel like it's meandering and it says one thing and then it says another thing, which, you know, funnily enough is what I was trying to embrace. But, you know, it doesn't, I'm still working on it. It still doesn't sit well with me. So writing this book was like a real kind of internal tug, I think. And especially compared to I Choose Eleanor, which was very straightforward in the sense that, you know, it was just confined to my story. It's a very short book. It was basically, you know, all I had to do was try and explain what I had learned about the potential connection between trauma and chronic illness, and the impact of trauma kind of on our lives. And that felt much more straightforward to me. And so even now I think about that book as being kind of better or something, because, you know, it doesn't deal with those kind of contradictions. But in this one, I really wanted to inhabit all of those spaces at once, and to acknowledge that we can be, you know, we can be recovering and also very far from recovered, and that we can be ill and we can be frustrated about being ill, and, you know, all of these things at the same time, and that we can understand some of the dynamics in our lives and the patterns that underscore our behavior without necessarily being able to change them, you know, because that's a huge part of trauma and it's a huge part of illness. And so I wanted to kind of embrace that a bit. And that's what I really hoped to do in this book. But, you know, I had to learn to do it while I was doing it, because, you know, there was a part of me that didn't like that, you know, didn't like things being less straightforward. So it was interesting, you know, it's an interesting part of the kind of journey, because it forced me to get a bit more comfortable with it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is really beautiful about this work is that it completely embodies all of these contradictory perspectives. And I think, especially when we haven't always had trauma, or when we talk to people who haven't had trauma, or people who aren't chronically ill, I think there is this very much expected linearity of, well, you'll get better, won't you? If you have therapy, you'll be fine. And it's like, you can have all the therapy in the world, or you can take all the medicine in the world, but your healing will not be linear. And some days you can be triggered and you'll be right back to the beginning, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think what I really enjoy about this book is I mean, I wouldn't say meandering. I think I'm going to use your word because you said it, but I think the kind of, just the narrative shapes you make in terms of structure, because it's not one step forward, two steps back. It's like, oh, actually, we got the bus that day, or we're going to go on a plane tomorrow, or we're going to take one step and then maybe we're just going to sit down because we can't deal with it. And it's just like, it's a really nice way of looking at it. And I think so, in kind of continuation and talking about form and narrative form of this kind of dialectical positionality you have in the text, one of the things I've really enjoyed about this work is the ethical reflections you pepper through as a trained journalist, survivor, and a person living with an eating disorder and a chronic illness, or several chronic illnesses. For example, on page 61, you're having a conversation with someone called Rowan, who has been hospitalized for an eating disorder, and you consider your own condition, and you say, is it right to connect yourself with a subject in this way, or is it manipulative? Is it helpful to tell her that I know what it feels like to want to grind yourself into nothingness, or is it harmful? And then later on page 113, when Amma, a girl who was sexually assaulted by her best friend, gets in touch to be interviewed and tells you that she's read I Choose Eleanor, you ask, by offering up my own story, have I forever compromised my ability to see hers clearly? Can I move between subject and narrator without undermining the project? And I wonder, how did you balance these questions ethically and interpersonally while researching, interviewing, and writing this book? And also, how did this process contribute to interweaving your own personal narrative amongst your participants and deciding where you put that in the overall structure of the book? Which is a massive question, sorry.
No, it's a great question. There's so many things to say about this. So the first thing to say is that when I set out to write this book, I didn't want there to be any of myself in it at all. I was very keen on that. I was so sick of myself. I never wanted to write about myself. I never, ever, ever imagined that I would write a book about myself. Like the whole project of my life, up until the point I disclosed this assault, had been not talking about myself ever to anyone, barely making any noise at all. Like I just, the idea of writing about myself and making myself the center of the story felt very uncomfortable to me. So I really didn't want to do it a second time. I really wanted to make this about other people. And we tried to write it that way. My editors and I tried to write it that way. And a few things happened. One was they said, just from a form perspective, this doesn't work because there's no through line and, it's hard to stay engaged, and that's kind of a more of a craft question. But then there's this ethical question. And it's interesting because my instinct was, the right thing to do ethically is to take myself out of it. I don't know whether because that's what you're trained to think as a journalist, or whether that's because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted myself not to be in it, and I wanted to not put more of my personal story out there. But whatever it was, I was thinking, the right thing for me to do is to stay out of this one and not involve myself. And one of my editors, and I've spoken to a lot of people about this since the book has come out, one of my editors said, also, I'm not sure, it doesn't quite feel right to be kind of conveying these stories of other people without expressing any vulnerability yourself. And I think that's probably right, which is why I decided in the end to do it the way I did it. But it was really not a straightforward decision at all. And I still don't know, if there is a right answer to that question. I ultimately felt like, because in the interviews I did, so much of these interviews, which were all, happened over a long period of time, were about, kind of a very reciprocal relationship. And I did end up talking a lot about things that had happened to me because, that's how those conversations work. And so I kind of wanted the book to reflect that. And I also didn't want it to feel like I was presenting stories that other people had trusted me with without being willing to open up myself. But then, of course, like we were saying right in the beginning, it's one of those things where, like, I have always really liked things that are clear, like one thing is right and one thing is wrong. And this was not that. And that meant that, of course, by putting myself in there, there's ethical considerations about that too. And, whether that feels like to anyone, like I'm telling someone else's story in order to use that to better understand my own, and I would never want it to come across that way. And I thought about that a lot as I was writing it. I guess this is an interesting thing about, again, the kind of the craft question or the writing question versus the ethics question, because I had a lot of people saying, this will read much better if you put more of yourself into it, or if you, go into your own memories, more frequently. But when I wrote it like that, it just felt ethically like that wasn't, I don't know, it felt more like I was using other people's stories to understand my own memories, and I didn't want it to come across like that. And, maybe it still does, I don't know. But I do think it's ethically very tricky. And I think it's worth being, upfront about the fact that it's complicated and there's not necessarily a right answer. But, you know, I just really wanted, and what was most important to me was that everyone felt, you know, like they were represented in a way that made sense to them, and that they liked the book. Everyone who's in the book liked the book. And so, you know, it was just a really fine line in the end. And I think this is another reason why I sometimes feel very unsure about this book, because, you know, I think you can tell in the book that I don't necessarily know what the right thing to do is. And that, you know, and that's something I try and resist. But I also think it's this kind of age-old journalism question about whether you should tell the reader what you carry with you that informs the way you interpret the world and informs the way you hear other people's stories. And as you and I were joking about just before everyone came in, you know, the people who I'm like, some of the reporters I meet are so determined to never let their own personal experiences come into telling a story, but I don't think that actually works. And I think that sometimes then that just hides your biases rather than biases. So I think, you know, I'm of the view that, you know, in journalism, we should be able to embrace the fact that the person telling the story is a person and will have their own context, and that can sometimes make things more meaningful rather than less. But, you know, there'd be loads of people who disagree with me on that. So it's definitely a live question.
Yeah, and this is what I find so interesting. I think this book balances really well the kind of idea, like, I mean, you and yourself occupy many different positionalities. And I think while you draw on your journalism training, I don't think it's necessarily reportage as we'd read when we click on to, like, you know, Al Jazeera or like the BBC or whatever. And I think the idea of pretending that news is neutral and the people who report is neutral is, in my opinion, such a falsity anyway. And I think what I really like about how you approach this book, and I don't think it reads as you using things to further your own narrative. I feel like it's simultaneously a continuation of I Choose Eleanor, but also a very separate book in and of itself, because you're speaking as part of a chorus, right? And I think if you weren't having these reflections as you were going along, I wonder how different a process that would be. And it's interesting that you had editors being like, there's a focal point missing here, or there's a narrative thread missing here. And I imagine to kind of continue into the next question, like, it is this shared vulnerability, because if you're occupying a very similar space to your participants, right? And if you're then putting yourself in this vulnerable position in the same narrative thread, it definitely reads in a very different way. And I really enjoy that. So I'm just going to keep talking about narrative because it's my favorite thing to do. So
I love talking about narrative.
Wonderful. So I'd like to discuss shame, and I guess a kind of continuation of narrative and personal narrative is the construction of the false self or selves that you mention in your book, and how you can counter those to reclaim personal narrative. So I'm just going to read from page 30, in which you reference Bradshaw's Healing the Shame That Binds You, and how experiencing chronic shame leads to the construction of the false self. So the quote goes, "Every story in this book is about how we learned the value of the false self, how we unlearned it, and the price we paid trying to attain it. As the false self is formed," Bradshaw says, "the authentic self goes into hiding. The false self is a masterpiece. Because the false self is an act of overcompensation for a part of us we believe to be damaged," he says, "it is always more than human or less than human." Then later on page 199, when experiencing a trauma response after performing a sexual act, you beautifully discuss the complexities of craving intimacy as a survivor, but also being a desperate, helpless romantic who is trying to shed the false self that she has created. And kind of continuing in what we've been saying, I think the way you confront shame in this very public forum is genuinely a brave thing to do, and that you do consistently across your writing. And when I read this book, I was struck by the different narrative versions of yourself. For example, you have the survivor, the interviewer or journalist, and then the author reflecting on the ethical, am I doing this right? And is this process or craft fair? And I wonder if you could discuss, firstly, whether memoir as a genre has allowed you to feel closer to this authentic self, we say in scare quotes, or selves. And secondly, whether the false self or performative self ever emerges when you are doing events or discussing your work.
Great question. Great question. Such an interesting question. So the false self, I just think, is such a valuable concept. And it was one of those things where, you know, I'd done all my interviews and I felt like all of the stories connected so deeply and importantly to each other. And I felt like there were so many themes that came out of it. But I was trying to write about that. And then I came across this idea of the false self. And it was one of those moments where something kind of clicked for me about what ties a lot of these things together. And, you know, it's this idea that shame and feeling shame and being shamed for who we are makes us feel as though we have to create an alternate version of ourselves for the world. And it makes us feel as though we have to present in a certain way and be a certain way in order to be accepted or loved or cared for. And, you know, this is especially true if you've been through trauma or illness, because, you know, you suddenly find yourself in a narrative that is outside of the kind of common narrative about, you know, the common capitalist narrative about being high functioning and busy and, you know, all of that stuff. And, you know, it's so we kind of form this version of ourselves that fits into that narrative to show the world, because, you know, we really want connection, and shame makes us feel disconnected, and shame makes us feel isolated. And so the false self can be so many different things. And that's what I, you know, don't think I realized. And what I definitely didn't realize is that up until I wrote I Choose Eleanor, like I really was very, very much presenting a false version of myself to the world. And the stories I told about myself were not true. You know, I was constantly talking about like being tough, and I would brag about not needing to sleep ever. Like I'd stay up all night doing work and like mad stuff I hate in retrospect and would never do now. I couldn't accept that I needed rest, and I couldn't accept that I was sick, and I couldn't accept that I was in pain, and I couldn't accept that I'd been assaulted, you know, and I was lying to myself about all of those things because I felt like I needed to, because I felt that the truth of it was not acceptable to the world. And the consequence of that is that it's very hard to understand who you truly are underneath that, because it's a lot of effort, right? You know, and I'm sure anyone here with a chronic illness knows the amount of time you spend pretending you don't have a chronic illness or acting like you don't have a chronic illness is exhausting, you know. And we do this in so many different ways, and it takes up all the time we have, really. So that leaves no time to kind of be curious about what, you know, what do I want? Who am I? What do I like? What do I care about? You know, whereas before, all my time was spent, you know, I couldn't care about anything except people not finding out that I was, you know, unwell, that I had been assaulted, that, you know, these basic facts about myself that I felt ashamed of and that I had been made to feel ashamed of. So I think I just found that interesting in terms of once you see the false self and why you're doing it, you know, it's such a, and this is what Bradshaw talks about, it's such a normal response to shame and trauma. In fact, you know, it's the most normal response to shame and trauma, because humans are wired for connection, and we need each other to survive. So at a basic level, if we think we're going to be cast out of the group for certain reasons, then we will try and, you know, make it seem like, you know, we'll do whatever we can to not be cast out. And so, you know, it makes sense. And it's a very normal response to having these things happen to you. And it was only when I understood that I could start to kind of unpick all the ways in which I do this and try and start to resist them and try and think about how I could be more in touch with who I actually am. And it's an interesting process, because if you've spent so long ignoring that, like really trying to ignore what you actually want, then sometimes it's hard to figure it out. But I think writing, to go to the first part of your question, I think writing memoir is a huge part of that. I think it's a really, really interesting form for this specifically, because, it allows you to explore creatively what the authentic self actually looks like. And it also allows you to kind of, reading and writing memoir, I think, allows you to connect with other people in a way that is incredibly safe. Like I felt before I wrote the essay that became I Choose Eleanor, the only reason I wrote it was because I was going through all this treatment for my assault just after I disclosed it. And the only thing I felt able to do in that time was read books. I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't engage with anyone because I couldn't keep up the facade. It was cracking. It was not working anymore. And no one knew that, this version of myself that they had seen all my life was not real. And no one knew then that it had kind of fallen apart. So anyway, all I did was read. And it was all memoir, and it's because I felt like I was sitting in a room with someone who was also trying to work out who their authentic self is, and that feels very safe to me, and it feels very, it feels like it allows you to connect with both the book and the writer in a way that makes you feel able to kind of explore what's going on in your own mind a bit more. And that's why I ended up writing it, because I thought, I want to try and use this form to explore what's happening and why I'm no longer able to keep up the kind of the version of my life that I've lived for, at that point, 25 years. I think memoir, and I think memoir, and I think this about the kind of the essay, the personal essay and the literary essay. It allows you freedom in narrative and in structure, and it allows you to connect ideas in writing that it's harder to connect with other forms. And that's the nonfiction, that's the creative nonfiction that I like the most. When sometimes you're reading and then, like Leslie Jameson does this a lot, you're reading and then something happened, or you're onto a topic and you're like, where are we going with this? I don't know what's going on. But it comes, or it all comes around and it's connected to the same metaphor, to the same idea. And I think the form kind of allows a lot more flexibility than other kinds of writing. And I really liked it for that reason.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's a really fertile ground for play as well. Like, even
Absolutely.
though these really kind of, we're talking about these really difficult things in our lives, it's kind of, okay, but what do I want it to look like? And it's kind of almost the ultimate sabotage of the false self, where you're kind of recreating authenticity through any lens you want and taking back that ownership from where your control was previously taken away from you, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's why it's such an interesting kind of, it's a really beautiful form to explore. And like you say, you can put anything in there. And I think this kind of theme that always comes back to me when I read your work is how you've completely sabotaged your false self in the biggest public way you can. You're kind of like, you've spent years curating this person, and then it's like, actually, how do I do it quickly, and how do I squash her? Like, and it's so kind of true. Like, right, because if I tell everyone, then I really can't go back on it.
And I can't do it. Absolutely. And that's the thing. I just blew it. Sorry, you go.
No, please go ahead.
No, I want to know what you wonder. Your questions are so cool.
No, I was going to ask, like, I wonder how tempting it is, like, when you do kind of feel yourself being like, oh, if I just, work a bit later, or if I just like put on a smile, or if I just go out even when I'm exhausted, like, I wonder how tempting it is to do that even more so now that you've put this very vulnerable self in place, the idea that you need to keep going and keep performing and progressing in this neoliberal perfect self way, right?
Totally. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, again, going back to what we started with, this idea that, it's so hard to accept that things aren't linear, and that every process is iterative and really complicated, especially things like this. And so you're exactly right in that sometimes, because I just did this big thing, everyone around me was like, you're such a Pisces. You told no one this assault for 11 years. And then you told everyone all at once, like everyone at the same time.
Oh, she a water sign. Yeah, we clocked her. Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone's like, yeah, this makes sense. So yeah, I just, did this thing where I like kind of blew the whole thing up really quickly, because there was no way I could do it incrementally. I just wouldn't have done it. I had to do something that I couldn't take back. I knew that. And I remember saying that to my editors. I said, when it was the first version of the essay was going to be published, they were like, are you sure about this? And I was like, you can't ask me that again, because like I will change my mind.
Yeah.
That's not what I want. So like, just do it. And then I was really ill and was in the middle of a pain flare, and I just took lots of painkillers and went to bed for a really long time, and then woke up and it was too late to take it back. So that went as planned. Having done that, sometimes it is even more tempting to kind of re-inhabit the version of myself that I think is acceptable to people, or that I think will be easy for people to digest, or easy for people to understand. I do that a lot. The amount of times I sit there and I think, I wish I could take all of this back. I wish I could just go back to being someone who no one really knew anything about, and who could just, whereas now when I introduce myself and when I talk about my work, obviously people find it difficult and people find it uncomfortable, and it's complicated. And so, yeah, I do have that. It's really tempting to go back to to the false self, and to go back to the question that you asked before, which I just realized I didn't answer. The thing about writing that is so great and so safe is that there is so much room for play. And when you're writing and reading, you're in this safe space where no one expects anything of you. But then when you're doing events, you go back into that mode where, sometimes it can feel like you have to present a certain version of yourself, which is why events like this are so great. Like so often I feel like I have to present myself in a certain way for events, but the more we create safe spaces like this where I can be like, I'm in bed, everyone's in bed, let's all be in bed, that's a version of kind of tackling the false self, right? It's like being like, I don't have to not be in bed to come to a book event. Yeah. Like I can be my actual self, which is lying down with 7 hot water bottles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is what's so interesting about, this form particularly, because I think people will very much expect a certain thing from you, like having done this grand reveal almost, but we're all still liminal and fluctuating and being very different things at once, like you can be, and I wonder, in fact, I'm going to save that question because I'm now thinking about liminality, but yeah.
Another one of my favorite concepts.
I know, always thinking about liminality, always being liminal as well. Like,
always being liminal.
Who are like survivors and chronically ill. It's kind of, this is what I think the book does really well, is that it's never one thing at once. It is dialectical. It is, as you call it, slippery. And I think there are so many liminal positions that are an either or I frame them as an either or in this question, but they're actually not an either or. They're a continual spectrum. So like, you talk about in the book, like being well or sick, thriving or surviving, being queer or not queer enough, being believed or disbelieved, or believing or disbelieving others when they talk about their experiences. And I think part of shame and trauma in your own story and those in the book is deeply doubting our perceptions of reality and what we believe to be true and what we know to be true about ourselves and about how we experience the world. And you describe this really beautifully on page 156, where you say, after years of being shamed in relationships, I often find myself with a distinct impression that I'm sliding between two worlds, like I'm slippery, stuck in some liminal space between reality and someone else's narrative. And although the slippery space that both you and your participants occupy is, continually in flux, your writing is so clear and concise and completely points down these very difficult, slippery, fluctuating spaces. And I wonder, I know we've briefly spoken about the narrative thread that is your voice that kind of arches throughout the book, but I was wondering if you could talk about how you decided to structure all of your testimonies and keep them so focused, despite the messy nature of trauma and narrative in and of itself.
Yeah, that's another great question. And another thing that I had a lot of back and forth with editors, because one of the things that is good about creative nonfiction, as we've said, is that it can be more explorative and more playful. But also still a lot of editors and, a lot of readers want something that's kind of really, structured in a certain way and where everything is tied up and all the loose ends are dealt with and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of that, editors saying, we need to know this thing about this person because readers will want to know about their siblings or something, whatever it was. And, it just doesn't read as well without knowing about their family life. And I would have to be like, well, they don't want to tell me about their family life. So sorry, but it's not going in there, and that narrative pool of wanting everything to be tied up is not going to be satisfied. Because it's just that's not how it works, and I think both me and everyone who's working on it really struggled with that, because I really wanted to be committed to that idea of not having to tie things up. And even with I Choose Eleanor, they kind of really wanted me to come up with a solution at the end or be positive at the end, and I was like, well, I don't feel positive. I don't have a solution, I don't have any answers. Yeah. It's hard to, if I did that, I'd just be fabricating, that would be like a false version of myself as well. And so with this, there was that same issue, but on a much bigger scale, because there are so many different stories, and none of them have the kind of arc that you would want if you were reading a short story, for example, or if you were reading a novel, when you're in complete control of the narrative. The whole point of these is that they're true, and therefore that they're complicated, and that, they don't have an ending because they haven't ended yet. At the point when I decided to sit down and write the book, I had the stories up until a certain point, but there was nothing conclusive about that. So I did find this really hard. I really didn't know how to kind of write something that people received as, compelling to read, or that editors were happy with, while also trying to stay in the space where things didn't have to be resolved. And what I ended up doing was, and this wasn't intentional at all, it was just the more interviews I did, I realized that there were certain things that kind of pulled everything together. Certain feeling, I spoke to all these people who've never met each other and who will never meet each other, but they were expressing feelings in the same phrases sometimes, using the same words, talking about the same feelings in their bodies. Like there was so much that connected them, even though they've never been in the same room, and so I wanted to draw out those things and try and have those things be another through line that kind of goes through the book, while also dedicating, a chapter to either each person or to each kind of general theme that I was talking about, so that I could bring a few people together in a chapter if they'd had similar experiences. But, again, it's something I went back and forth on a lot. And I don't know if I would do, I don't know if I would make different decisions if I wrote the book again. Because I do think that there's a lot of, it was hard to kind of tie it all together when I wanted to write something that wasn't tied together.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting as well, as, as a writer who also does journalism, I think the desire to make everything very neatly packaged, and also being instructed in the kind of like publishing industrial complex to make something like harrowing, but also she's doing fine now, look how good she is, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's really what is so kind of like revolutionary about books like this, is that they're not only timestamps of you writing them as a writer, but also the very timestamp of different individuals being interviewed at that very particular moment of their life and what they choose to share with you and what they choose to omit as well. And I think that's something you also highlight really well in this book, is omissions. And I think the idea of you being, you know, perhaps somewhat dissatisfied or questioning the process of you writing this book is also as important as the writing itself, because it's like nothing is ever going to be the perfect book on shame. You know, like we look at books like, you know, The Body Keeps the Score, and we believe in it because it's so factual. But equally, it's like we have no idea what's happening to those participants now. We have no idea if their trauma's fixed, right? And it's going to be. And it's just this continual, I mean, yeah, that's all we're doing, isn't it? We're like, as Lucille Clifton says in one of her poems, like, I continue to continue. And I'd always found that too. We continue to continue despite everything that happens to us, right?
Exactly. And that's all it is. And there's no kind of beginning, middle, or end, which is why it's so interesting to bring things like trauma and illness together with something like narrative, because they are strange bedfellows in that way. You know, they're not, it's a, because of the way we're socialized to think about narrative is not the way those things are experienced. So bringing them together requires a lot of negotiation. And even, you know, I always think this is an interesting example. The first time I was taught about traumatic memory, and it, you know, just all morning in court, in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, we've been hearing from an expert about traumatic memory and how it is stored. And I remember, you know, this is the first thing that I was told when I disclosed my assault, was that, you know, when something happens that is traumatic or overwhelming, the brain can't store the memory in a narrative form. So every other memory that we have, we put into a narrative, sometimes to the point where it blurs the memory, because we want to say this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And that's how we store it. And it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Traumatic memories can't be stored that way because they're too overwhelming in the moment. So they are stored in fragments. They're stored in senses and sounds and things like that. And they're not stored in a story, which is why it's so hard to recount them, because it feels very confusing as to what order things happened in, you know, where we were, all this stuff. And that's kind of a metaphor for all of this, right? You know, those memories kind of escape narrative in the way that we've been taught to think about narrative, which is straightforward and yeah. And in that same way, more broadly, you know, our stories as human beings don't fit into narratives that we've been taught they should. And so reconciling those two things and kind of being like, how can I use narrative to do something that it doesn't really want to do or wasn't really designed to do, which is accommodate all of these kind of lingering questions and the things that aren't resolved and the things that don't have a clear linearity or don't have a clear kind of underlying rationale to them.
Exactly. And I think that kind of leads me on to what I'd like to ask you about your kind of next project and where you are at the moment, which is, you know, reporting the Maxwell trial. And I'd like to discuss abolition and rape before opening up questions to the audience. I'm just going to drop a resource in the chat, which is by abolitionist thinkers and practitioners, Mariam Carver and Eva Nagel, and also a link to Abolitionist Futures, which is a community of activists working across the UK to share abolitionist resources for those who are interested. So in chapter 9 of My Body Keeps Your Secrets, you discuss Cleo, Riley and Victoria's testimonies, which involved them reporting their rapes and sexual assaults to the police. And you intersperse this chapter with data on untested rape kits in the UK, increasingly low levels of completed persecutions in raped flag cases, which I think is a horrible phrase in and of itself, despite instances of rape and its reportage increasing. And I think a common question that always comes up when we talk about abolitionist thinking, which I'm defining for the sake of this question as imagining a world that seeks alternatives to prisons and police and state harm based in principles of transformative justice. So a question that always comes up when we think about this is, well, what about the rapists, right? So while carceral feminism, quote, advocates for enhancing and increasing prison sentences that deal with feminist and gender issues, this chapter is really interesting because it questions what justice looks like, but also places precedent on the narratives of survivors and of being believed. And I think this is one of my favorite parts of the book, because you conclude with this gut-wrenching paragraph on page 191 about Cleo, who is sexually assaulted while she's having a massage and reports it. She's also a lawyer as well, so she's working on these very harrowing cases, and you know the parallels are there with Lucia's kind of life as well, and her narrative and her work.
Yeah.
So in this quote, you say, "In all the hours that she speaks, Cleo never mentions whether or not her attacker was convicted. I'm not sure if she is aware that she has left this out, but I want to let it stand on its own, this absence. If it is not important to her, then it is not important to me. Like I said, this book isn't about him." And I've read that chapter over and over again. And every time I think about that paragraph, I'm just like, oof, you know? So another kind of twofold question, which I'm doing a lot this evening. So firstly, to quote Adrian Rich, you do on page 41, when a woman tells the truth, she is creating the possibility for more truth around her. And I wondered, do you see this collection of narratives contributing to a type of transformative justice for the participants involved? And then I'll ask you the second question after that. So yeah, we'll do that one.
Yeah, well, this is, again, such a good question, and, you know, is really something I'm thinking about a lot right now, and is kind of exactly what my next book is going to be about, because I do think that there is a version of transformative justice that is about truth and about being believed and about being validated, and that is not about prioritizing punishment. And you know, I think the thing that at least the survivors I speak to and the people I speak to, you know, it is so much more important to have a story recognized and validated than it is to have someone punished. And I think that's, you know, exactly the thing with Cleo. You know, we still talk all the time, and she's still never told me what happened. And this is another thing I really had to fight for. Like, my editors were like, you have to go back and ask. You can't finish the chapter like that. You can't. You know, you have to go back and ask, and you have to finish with how it. And I was like, well, I don't want to. No. Because again, you know, it felt like it wasn't resolved. But I just, you know, I kind of want to make the point that that's not actually necessarily the resolution, right? You know, and getting a resolution through the criminal justice system might be incredibly important to some people, but it doesn't have to be. And it doesn't have to be the thing that kind of ticks something off as resolved, especially because we know the system is not designed to deal with these types of crimes, and in general is the worst and most traumatic system we've ever invented as a society. So this idea of kind of striving for a good outcome in the criminal justice system is really tricky. And it leads to these kind of very carceral feminist narratives where you just hear people saying, I hope he goes to jail for 100 years for that, as if that's the win, you know, like that's how we prove that it's now being taken seriously. Yeah. And yeah, I think that is kind of the opposite. Well, that's very different to a version of justice that involves kind of prioritizing truth and making people feel seen and understood and validated, rather than making it all about the perpetrator and the punishment, you know, and what happens to them. And you see this in the criminal justice system in general, you know, nothing about the sex crime cases that do get prosecuted. The victims aren't involved at all, you know, and they're not consulted and they're not made to feel a part of it. And the system is set up so that, you know, it's set up so the best thing for a defendant to do is to blanketly deny everything, which is, you know, not useful for a survivor who wants to feel believed. Like, it's just nothing about the system works.
Exactly. And I think like that's what's really interesting about kind of like narrative as a counter to this, because not only does this book for me act like a choral endeavor, but it also does contribute to this kind of how narrative can be transformative justice. Because I think the most, we spoke with Amy Berkowitz at the beginning of our series, and there's a line that I always think about in her memoir, Tender Points, where she says, all I have to do is tell you, all you have to do is believe me. And I think it flattens it to this really, well, it's not that complicated, but then it kind of falls into, okay, but how do you prove it? And like, also, do I really believe you? And I think it's something Leslie Jameson does very well in her essay on right? When she's kind of, she goes through this kind of, well, do I believe them? Like, oh, I feel guilty because I'm believing them, but should I be? And it's very interesting. And I wonder if you could just kind of tease us a little bit about what your next book is going to be working on and how central this trial that you're reporting on at the moment will be to that narrative.
Yeah, well, it is actually, it uses this trial, the idea of the book is that it uses this trial as an argument for abolition.
Wonderful.
So basically saying it uses this trial as a narrative structure because firstly, I think it's really interesting how much we all love trial narratives, myself included. You know, they're very compelling, and that's, they have a beginning and a middle and an end, and they have a resolution, and it's one way or the other, and someone wins and someone loses. You know, it's this, it's kind of the archetype, the thing we look for in stories. And so people get really drawn into them, which then leads you to be kind of really drawn into and invested in this idea that if someone gets convicted, then justice is served. You know, if someone gets sent to jail, then justice is served. And I want to kind of use that to then, I guess, subvert that notion at the end of that story, and ask ourselves, you know, is this really what we want justice to look like? You know, or is there a way that we can, you know, if we understand trauma, if we take trauma seriously, then prison is not the answer to cycles of trauma and patterns of interpersonal violence. You know, we know it makes all those things worse. And so basically, I want to use this trial because I think there are really interesting dynamics. It draws out really interesting interpersonal dynamics, and it draws out really interesting questions about how trauma works and the long-term effects trauma has on people. And then I want to use the trial narrative to explore that, but then also in the kind of more overarching point of the book, while exploring all of those things, is to really challenge this idea that the way that we take sexual violence seriously is by throwing people in prison, because, you know, I don't think that's the answer. And I just feel, I hear it so often, as you said in your question, you know, there's a really kind of strong sense that the way that we'll know that we've succeeded at making people take this seriously is if we have more and more people in prison on charges relating to sexual violence. And, you know, I think if we, you know, we're at a juncture where we could really sit down and think about this and come up with a better way. Because prison is an incredibly destructive place. It's a broken system. And also the system that leads to someone being put in prison is traumatic for survivors as well. You know, it doesn't work for anyone in this situation. And I don't think we can tinker with it around the edges. I don't think it can be reformed. I think we need to come up with something else. And something that is about transformative justice, something that is about healing and truth and understanding. So that's the aim of the book.
That sounds phenomenal. I can't wait to read it. Well, if you need a proofreader, hit me
up. Don't say that. I will send it to you.
Oh no, please do. I'm going to open to questions from the audience. If anyone's got any, just drop them in the chat. But just while everyone's people might be typing, I'll just say thank you again to Lucia for being so generous in sharing her time and reflections while she's doing really important work in New York City. And you can find out more about Lucia's upcoming projects by visiting her website, which is luciaosbornecrowley.com, or by following her on Instagram at luciaoc, or Twitter at the same handle with an underscore at the end. So it doesn't look like we've got any questions so far, which is great because I've probably asked all of them ever. So thank you so much for everyone who's joined us, both tonight and throughout the discussion series. Resting Up Collective has some more creative opportunities coming up in the next few months, which you can find out more about by visiting our Instagram page. And we've just had, thanks. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
thanks for your nice
really
messages in the chat.
But until then, everyone, stay well, stay safe, and stay warm, and have a lovely holiday season. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.